Story number 1. The Summit of Shadows. Devil's Tower looms over the Wyoming landscape like a sentinel, ancient and otherworldly. It's a place of myths and whispers, where stories of lost climbers and unexplainable lights swirl like the ever-present mist around its peak. We had no business being there, but isn't that how these stories always begin? A group of thrill-seekers chasing a high, only to find themselves in the jaws of something they couldn't understand. Our group consisted of 5, me, my best friend Danny, his girlfriend Alice, our old climbing buddy Marcus, and Lisa, a geology student who joined us on a whim. The climb was supposed to be straightforward. Devil's Tower isn't Everest. It's a challenge, sure, but not the kind that should leave experienced climbers like us shaken. Yet from the moment we set foot on the trail, something felt off. The air around the tower seemed heavier than usual, the sky grayer despite the clear forecast. Birds circled above, but they never landed. The locals had given us plenty of warnings. The tower was sacred to their people, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. They spoke of giants that lived in the mists, ancient beings that existed long before humanity. We laughed it off, of course. Folklore is part of the charm, right? The first day of the climb went smoothly. The weather held, and we made good progress, setting up camp on a wide ledge halfway to the summit. The view was breathtaking, the landscape below stretching endlessly in every direction. But as night fell, the first crack in our bravado appeared. It started with a sound, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the rock itself. We paused, listening, but it faded as quickly as it came. "Wind," Marcus said, though his voice lacked conviction. None of us wanted to admit how uneasy it made us feel. That night, I dreamed of shadows. Towering figures moved through the mist, their forms indistinct but massive. They didn't speak, but their presence was overwhelming, pressing down on me like a physical weight. When I woke, my chest ached, as if I'd been holding my breath for hours. "Did you guys hear anything last night?" Lisa asked over breakfast, her eyes darting nervously to the edge of the ledge. We all shook our heads, though I could tell from their expressions that I wasn't the only one who'd had a restless night. By midday, we reached the summit. The climb had been harder than expected. The rock felt slicker than it should have been, and the air grew colder the higher we climbed. When we finally pulled ourselves over the edge, the sense of triumph was muted by the strange stillness that greeted us. The summit was shrouded in mist, thick and impenetrable. It clung to our skin, cold and damp, muffling sound and distorting shapes. Our radios crackled with static, and no matter how many times Marcus adjusted the frequency, we couldn't get a signal. It was as if the world below us had ceased to exist. "Let's take some pictures and head back," Alice said, her voice shaky. She was usually the fearless one, but even she seemed unnerved by the oppressive silence. As we moved through the mist, the shadows began to appear. At first, they were faint, dark smudges at the edge of our vision, too distant to make out clearly. But as the day wore on, they grew bolder, larger. They towered over us, their forms shifting and rippling like smoke. "What the hell is that?" Danny whispered, pointing to a shape that loomed ahead of us. It was vaguely humanoid, but impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and unnatural. It stood motionless, as if watching us, before melting back into the mist. "Let's go," Marcus said, his voice firm. "Now." We turned back toward the trail, but the summit had changed. The terrain was unfamiliar, the landmarks we'd noted earlier nowhere to be seen. The mist thickened, swallowing our voices and footsteps. It felt like we were walking in circles, the same jagged rocks and sparse patches of grass repeating endlessly. And then the whispers began. They came from every direction, soft and indistinct, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. The language was unfamiliar, but the tone was clear, angry, accusing. "This isn't real," Lisa muttered, her hands clutching the straps of her pack. "It's just the altitude messing with our heads." But it was real. Too real. The shadows grew closer, their forms solidifying. Their faces, or what passed for faces, were featureless, smooth and blank, yet somehow filled with malice. One of them reached out, its arm stretching unnaturally, the tips of its fingers brushing against my shoulder. The touch burned, a searing pain that shot through my entire body. I screamed, stumbling back, and the others froze. Run, I gasped, the word barely audible through the pain. We ran blindly, the mist swirling around us, the shadows closing in. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a deafening roar. I tripped, falling hard onto the rocky ground, and when I looked up, one of the figures was standing over me. Its head tilted, as if steadying me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in its blank face, a flicker of recognition, or pity. Then Danny was there, pulling me to my feet. We stumbled forward, the others close behind, until we broke through the mist and found ourselves back at the edge of the summit. The trail was there, clear and unobstructed, as if nothing had happened. We didn't stop until we reached the base of the tower, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for air. The mist still clung to the summit above us, but the shadows were gone. The air was warmer, the sounds of the forest below grounding us in reality. We never spoke about what happened up there. Not to each other, not to anyone. But I still dream of the shadows, their blank faces and burning touch. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, faint and insistent, calling me back to the summit of Devil's Tower. Story number 2. The depths below. There's a feeling you get in a cave, deep underground, where the light fades and the silence presses in like a living thing. It's not fear, exactly. It's smaller, quieter, an insistent whisper reminding you that you don't belong. That's what Mammoth Cave was like that day, a place so vast and unknowable it felt alive. And maybe it was. Our team consisted of 6, me, the lead geologist, Carrie, a caver with nerves of steel, Marcus, our cartographer, Sheila, a historian specializing in ancient symbols, and Dan and Ray, the muscle, 2 guys who'd spent more time rappelling down cliffs than sitting in classrooms. We were there for the same reason everyone else comes to Mammoth Cave, discovery. New passages. Hidden chambers. The kind of finds that earn you a line in a textbook or a segment on the evening news. The first 2 days were uneventful. We mapped a few minor tunnels, cataloged some unique rock formations, and celebrated when we hit a dead end less often than expected. But on the 3rd day, everything changed. We were following a narrow passage that snaked deeper than the others, its walls slick with condensation and streaked with veins of black stone. The air was colder, carrying a faint metallic tang that burned at the back of my throat. It felt wrong, somehow, but none of us said it out loud. There was too much pride at stake. Carrie was the first to notice the markings. At first glance, they looked like scratches, random and chaotic. But as we moved further in, the patterns became deliberate, curved lines, intersecting circles, and jagged symbols etched into the rock. Sheila crouched beside one, tracing her gloved fingers over the grooves. "These aren't natural," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "This is ancient. Prehistoric, maybe. Who would have made them?" Marcus asked, shining his flashlight down the passage. Sheila didn't answer right away. "Cave dwellers, perhaps," she said finally. "Or something else." We pressed on, the air growing colder with every step. The passage widened into a cavern, its ceiling so high our flashlights barely reached it. Stalagmites jutted from the ground like jagged teeth, and the walls were covered in more of the symbols, their patterns more intricate and unsettling. At the center of the cavern was a pit, a gaping void surrounded by rocks stained a deep, rusty red. "What the hell is this?" Dan muttered, peering over the edge. His voice echoed, the sound swallowed by the darkness below. "I don't know," I said. "But we're not equipped for this kind of depth. Let's mark it and come back with the right gear." "No way," Carrie said, already securing a rope to one of the nearby stalagmites. "We're here now. We're prepared enough." There was no stopping her. Carrie was the kind of person who didn't know the meaning of hesitation. She descended first, her headlamp a faint speck in the darkness as she disappeared into the pit. The rest of us followed, one by one, until we reached the bottom. The air was suffocatingly cold, the walls slick with some kind of viscous black substance that gleamed under our lights. The markings were everywhere, spiraling across the rock in patterns that seemed almost intentional. At the far end of the chamber was a narrow opening, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "You guys hearing that?" Ray said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Hearing what?" I asked. He didn't answer, but his eyes darted nervously around the chamber. That's when I heard it too, a faint, rhythmic clicking, like stones tapping together. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in the stillness. "Let's check it out," Carrie said, already heading for the opening. "Wait," Sheila said, her voice trembling. "We shouldn't." But Carrie was gone. Cursing under my breath, I followed, the others close behind. The passage twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until it felt like the cave was closing in on us. The clicking grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. The passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the last but no less disturbing. At its center stood a stone altar, its surface carved with more of the symbols. Around it were skeletal remains, human remains. The bones were twisted, elongated, as if warped by some horrific force. Their empty eye sockets seemed to stare at us, accusing and pleading all at once. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, his face pale. And then the clicking stopped. For a moment, the silence was absolute, pressing down on us like a physical weight. Then the shadows moved. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the flicker of our headlamps against the uneven walls. But the shapes were real, humanoid figures crawling from the darkness, their limbs unnaturally long, their skin pale and glistening. Their eyes were empty sockets, but they seemed to see us, their heads tilting in unison. Carrie screamed, and the spell broke. We ran, scrambling back through the narrow passage, the creatures close behind. Their movements were jerky but fast, the clicking sound returning, louder and more frantic. I don't know how we made it back to the first chamber, but we did, panting and stumbling as we scrambled up the ropes. Marcus was the last one out. As he climbed, one of the creatures reached for him, its clawed fingers raking across his leg. He screamed, the sound echoing through the cavern, but we managed to pull him out before it could drag him down. We didn't stop running until we were back at the surface, the pale light of dawn spilling over the horizon. None of us spoke as we packed up our gear and left. There was nothing to say. We all knew the truth, something was down there, something ancient and wrong. Marcus didn't last long. The scratch on his leg turned black, the infection spreading faster than any doctor could explain. He raved about the creatures in his final hours, begging us to seal the entrance. We tried. The passage we'd used was collapsed, the rocks too heavy to move. But the cave is vast, its tunnels stretching for miles, and I know we didn't seal them all. Sometimes, at night, I hear the clicking, the same rhythmic sound, faint but insistent, as if it's calling me back. Mammoth Cave holds many secrets, but not all of them are meant to be found. If you ever hear the call, do yourself a favor, don't answer. Some doors should stay closed, no matter how curious you are. Story number 3. The Bone Sculptor. The Olympic rainforest is a place that swallows sound, light, and time. The canopy above is so thick it turns daylight into a muted green haze, and the air is heavy with the scent of moss and decay. It's the kind of place where you could walk in circles for days and never realize it, if you make it out at all. For us, it was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to find evidence of Bigfoot or, at the very least, come back with a good story to tell. But the forest had other plans. There were 5 of us, me, my younger brother Jake, his girlfriend Amber, and our friends Nate and Emily. Jake was the believer. He'd been obsessed with cryptids since we were kids, devouring every book and documentary he could find. When he heard about the Olympic National Park being a hotspot for Bigfoot sightings, there was no talking him out of it. I tagged along because I'd always been the older sibling who had to keep him out of trouble. The first day was uneventful. We parked at a trailhead far from the usual tourist routes and hiked deep into the forest, setting up camp near a stream. The forest was alive with sound, birds, insects, the distant rustle of branches in the wind. It was beautiful, but it felt heavy, like the trees were watching us. Jake was giddy with excitement, snapping photos of everything, tree trunks with strange scratches, large footprints in the mud that might have been from a bear. He was convinced we were close to something big. That night, we heard the first noises. Low, guttural growls, followed by the snap of branches. They came from deeper in the forest, far enough away to feel safe, but close enough to keep us on edge. Jake insisted it was Bigfoot. The rest of us weren't so sure. By the second day, the forest felt different. quieter. The birds were gone, and even the wind seemed to have stopped. As we moved further in, we started finding things. The first was a pile of bones, deer, by the looks of it. They were arranged in a strange, almost artistic way, stacked and intertwined to form a kind of spiral. Jake took pictures, grinning like he'd struck gold. The rest of us weren't as thrilled. "It's probably just a hunter," Nate said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Or a trapper trying to scare people off." Emily shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. "Let's just keep moving." We found more as we went, smaller sculptures made of bones, some tied together with strips of sinew, others suspended from branches like grotesque wind chimes. The deeper we went, the worse they got. One sculpture was shaped like a human figure, its limbs impossibly long, its head crowned with antlers. "Someone's living out here," Amber said, her voice shaking. "This isn't Bigfoot. This is something else." That night, we heard the growls again, but this time they were closer. Louder. Something moved through the trees, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. We stayed huddled in our tents, barely daring to breathe. Around midnight, the sound stopped, replaced by a new noise, a slow, deliberate scraping, like claws against bark. In the morning, we found the marks. Deep gouges in the trees surrounding our camp, arranged in patterns that made my stomach churn. Jake was fascinated, snapping photos and muttering about territorial markings. "We need to go back," Emily said, her voice trembling. "This isn't what we signed up for." But Jake wouldn't hear it. "We're close," he said, his eyes wild. "Don't you see? This is it. This is what we came for." Reluctantly, we pressed on, though none of us could shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed darker now, the trees pressing in on us, their branches twisted like grasping fingers. And then we found the den. It was a clearing, hidden behind a wall of brambles. In the center stood a massive structure made of bones, at least 10 feet tall. It was shaped like a nest, with an opening at the top and a faint, foul odor wafting from within. Around it were more sculptures, more markings, and of clothing. Tattered scraps of fabric tangled in the branches. I recognized the logo on one of the shirts. It was from a local hiking club, one that had lost members to the forest over the years. "We're leaving," I said, my voice firm. "Now." But before we could move, the forest came alive. The growls erupted around us, joined by the sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps. The shadows moved, and for the first time, we saw them. They were tall, their forms barely human, with limbs too long and eyes that gleamed in the dim light. Their skin was mottled and pale, stretched tight over skeletal frames. One stepped into the clearing, its head tilting as it regarded us. In its hands, it held a skull, its bony fingers tracing the surface as if in reverence. Jake took a step forward, his camera shaking in his hands. "It's them," he whispered. "It's really them." "Jake, no!" I shouted, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. The creature moved faster than I thought possible, covering the distance between us in seconds. It didn't attack, not at first. It simply stood there, its empty eyes staring into mine. Then it opened its mouth, and the sound that came out was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a guttural, screeching wail that froze my blood. We ran. I don't remember much of the escape, just flashes of movement and the pounding of my heart. The creatures were everywhere, their shapes flitting through the trees, their cries echoing in the darkness. At one point, I heard Amber scream, but when I turned back, she was gone. By the time we stumbled out of the forest, it was just me, Jake, and Emily. We didn't speak. We didn't have to. The terror in our eyes said everything. That was 6 months ago. Jake hasn't touched his camera since. He barely talks, spending his days staring out the window, his hands shaking whenever the wind rustles the trees. Emily moved away, refusing to go near a forest ever again. As for me, I still hear them sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet, I hear the growls and the scraping, faint but unmistakable. They're waiting, I think, for someone else to wander too far into their world. And when they do, the bone sculptor will be ready. Story number 4. The Cursed Temple of the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon is a place of awe and mystery, its vast expanse a testament to nature's power and time's patience. But hidden within its walls are secrets that defy explanation, stories buried so deep they're barely whispers. For our archaeological team, it was supposed to be a groundbreaking expedition, a chance to uncover history long forgotten. Instead, it became a nightmare I'll never escape. Our team consisted of Dr. Leonard Harkins, the renowned archaeologist leading the expedition, his protege and my best friend, Julia, Carter, the tech-savvy drone operator, Megan, the photographer with an eye for the extraordinary, and me, Ethan, the assistant who mostly carried the gear and tried not to mess things up. We'd been granted special permission to explore an uncharted section of the canyon, a remote area known for its sheer cliffs and treacherous terrain. The locals had their warnings, stories of spirits that guarded the ancient sites, curses that befell anyone who dared disturb them. Dr. Harkins waved them off, chalking it up to folklore. But I could see the unease in Julia's eyes as we set up camp at the base of the cliffs. The discovery came on the second day. Carter's drone picked up something unusual, a faint outline of what appeared to be an opening, hidden behind an overhang of rock and vegetation. It wasn't marked on any of the maps, and from the angle, it looked inaccessible without climbing gear. Naturally, Harkins was ecstatic. "This could be the find of a lifetime," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. An untouched relic of an ancient civilization. The climb was harrowing, the rock face sheer and unforgiving. By the time we reached the entrance, my hands were raw and my muscles ached. The opening was small, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through, but inside, the space expanded into a narrow tunnel, its walls smooth and unnaturally cold. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Julia ran her hand along the wall, her flashlight revealing faint carvings, symbols, and figures that seemed to tell a story. "These aren't like anything I've seen before," she whispered. "They're older." The tunnel opened into a massive chamber, and that's when we saw it, the temple. It was carved directly into the rock, its facade ornate and imposing, with pillars etched in intricate detail and a set of massive doors flanked by statues. The statues were humanoid but distorted, their proportions unsettlingly wrong. Their faces were featureless, their hands extended as if in warning or welcome. "Unbelievable," Harkins said, stepping forward as if in a trance. "This predates anything we've found in the region." We spent hours documenting the site, Megan snapping photos while Carter scanned the area with his equipment. Julia focused on the carvings, trying to decipher their meaning. I stayed near the entrance, an unease settling in my chest that I couldn't shake. The statues seemed to watch us, their blank faces angled ever so slightly toward our movements. Then Harkins found the altar. It was set in the center of the chamber, a massive stone slab covered in symbols and surrounded by smaller carvings of what looked like offerings, bowls, tools, and figurines. At the altar's base was a large urn, sealed with a waxy substance and covered in markings that Julia identified as warnings. "Do not disturb," she translated, her voice tight. "This is a curse." Harkins laughed. "Superstition," he said, kneeling to examine the urn. "This could contain artifacts, writings, something invaluable." "Or something dangerous," Julia shot back, but he ignored her. The moment he broke the seal, the air in the chamber shifted. The temperature plummeted, and a deep, resonant hum filled the space, vibrating through the stone and into my bones. The statues began to move. At first, it was subtle, the tilt of a head, the flex of a hand. Then their limbs began to creak, stone grinding against stone as they stepped off their pedestals. Their movements were jerky but purposeful, their blank faces now turned fully toward us. "Run!" Julia screamed, grabbing my arm. We bolted for the tunnel, the sound of stone scraping against rock echoing behind us. The statues moved faster than I thought possible, their heavy footsteps growing louder as they closed the distance. Carter tripped, his scream cut short as one of the statues reached him. I didn't look back, but I heard the sickening crunch of bone and the sound of something wet hitting the floor. We reached the tunnel, but the statues didn't stop. They squeezed through the narrow passage, their forms seeming to shift and adapt to the confined space. Megan was next, pulled into the darkness by a hand that wrapped around her ankle. Her cries for help were drowned out by the hum, now deafening. By the time we reached the outside, it was just me, Julia, and Harkins. We scrambled down the cliffside, the statues still following, their blank faces emotionless yet filled with intent. One of them reached for Julia, its fingers brushing her shoulder and leaving a jagged, frostbitten scar. I grabbed her hand and pulled her down the last stretch, our feet hitting solid ground just as the first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon. The statues stopped at the edge of the cliff, their forms frozen once more. The hum faded, replaced by the distant sound of wind through the canyon. We didn't speak as we packed our gear and left. Harkins clutched the urn like a lifeline, his eyes hollow and haunted. Julia hasn't forgiven him, or me, for what happened. She spends her days poring over the photos and notes we managed to salvage, trying to make sense of it all. The urn is still out there, locked away in a secure facility, its contents unstudied. But I can feel its presence, even from miles away. At night, I hear the hum again, faint but insistent, calling me back to the temple. Sometimes, I dream of the statues, their blank faces staring as they whisper in a language I can't understand. The Grand Canyon holds many secrets, but some are meant to stay buried. If you ever find yourself standing at the edge of a discovery that feels too good to be true, do yourself a favor, walk away. Some doors are better left unopened, and some curses are better left undisturbed. Story number 5. Salt Flats Eternal. The Bonneville Salt Flats are a strange place, even in the daylight. Stretching endlessly in every direction, the ground is so flat and white it tricks your eyes, makes you question what's real. At night, it's even stranger, an expanse of nothingness under a blanket of stars, quiet and eerie. So naturally, when my friend suggested we join a midnight scavenger hunt out there, I didn't think twice. It was supposed to be simple: drive out, find a few landmarks based on vague clues, take pictures as proof, and head back to the meetup spot. The rules were clear: stay within the designated area, and don't wander off too far. But rules are meant to be broken, right? At least, that's what we told ourselves. There were 4 of us: me, my girlfriend Hannah, my best friend Nate, and his girlfriend Allie. We were all in one car, a beat-up Subaru that Nate insisted was adventure-ready. The first few clues were easy. We found an old signpost half buried in salt, a broken-down shed that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, and even a rusted motorcycle lying on its side. We were having fun, laughing and joking as we snapped pictures and crossed items off our list. Then we saw the car. It was sitting in the middle of the flats, its black frame stark against the white salt. At first, we thought it was part of the scavenger hunt, a bonus clue, maybe. But as we got closer, something about it felt off. It was an old sedan, the kind you'd see in movies from the 50s, with rounded edges and a chrome grille. The paint was chipped and faded, and one of the windows was cracked, but it didn't look abandoned. The tires were intact, and the body was free of rust. "What the hell is this doing out here?" Nate asked, walking around the car with his flashlight. "Maybe it belongs to someone from the competition," Hannah said, though her voice wavered. "Then where are they?" I asked. The salt around the car was undisturbed, as if it had just appeared out of nowhere. That's when we noticed the footprints. They led away from the car, a single trail of bare feet heading out into the flats. The prints were perfect, each toe distinct, as if someone had just walked there moments ago. But there were no prints leading to the car, only away from it. "This feels wrong," Allie said, hugging her jacket tighter around her. "We should go back." But Nate, ever the thrill seeker, had other ideas. "Come on, don't you want to see where they go? Maybe it's another clue." Against my better judgment, we followed him. The footprints stretched on, perfectly straight, as if whoever made them had walked with unwavering purpose. The further we went, the more uneasy I felt. The air was colder now, biting against my skin, and the salt beneath our feet seemed to crunch louder than before. The stars above, once a brilliant canvas, felt dimmer, as if the sky itself was closing in. "We should turn back," Hannah said after what felt like an hour. "We're going too far." "Almost there," Nate called over his shoulder, though he didn't sound convinced. The footprints continued, unbroken and unchanging, leading us deeper into the emptiness. And then, suddenly, we were back at the car. It didn't make sense. We hadn't turned around, hadn't deviated from the trail. Yet there it was, sitting in the same spot, its black frame gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The footprints led straight to it, ending abruptly at the driver's side door. This is impossible, Allie stammered, her voice trembling. Maybe we got turned around, Nate said, though his face betrayed his uncertainty. Let's try again. So we did. We followed the footprints again, walking faster this time, our nerves fraying with every step. The salt flats stretched endlessly around us, an infinite expanse of white. The cold grew sharper, the stars dimmer, and the silence heavier. And then, once again, we found ourselves back at the car. By the third loop, panic had set in. Nate stopped pretending to be confident, and Allie clung to him, her eyes wide with fear. This isn't real, she kept muttering. This isn't real. I tried to stay calm, tried to think rationally, but my thoughts were a mess. It felt like the salt flats were alive, watching us, toying with us. The car sat there, silent and unmoving, its presence almost mocking. The footprints were still there, leading us in circles like a cruel joke. We have to stop following them, Hannah said, her voice shaking. It's the footprints. They're trapping us. What do you suggest? Nate snapped. Just wander aimlessly? That's how people die out here. People die when they ignore the obvious, she shot back. Look around. Does any of this feel right to you? None of it did. But we had no other plan, so we stopped following the trail. Instead, we picked a direction at random and started walking, leaving the car and its footprints behind. The salt stretched on endlessly, featureless and unchanging. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into my bones, and the air felt thick, each breath a struggle. That's when the whispers started. At first, I thought it was the wind, faint and distant. But the sound grew louder, a chorus of voices overlapping and intertwining, speaking words I couldn't understand. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing in my head. They're watching us, Allie whimpered, her eyes darting wildly. Who? I demanded, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Before she could respond, the ground beneath us shifted. The salt cracked and splintered, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I thought it was going to swallow us whole. But then it stopped, leaving us standing on an unbroken expanse once more. And there it was. The car. It was waiting for us, its black frame gleaming as if it had never moved. The footprints were gone now, but the door was open, its dark interior an invitation or a warning. We're not getting out of here, Nate said, his voice hollow. It won't let us. I don't know who climbed in first. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was all of us at once. But as I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the endless salt flats through the windshield, I felt the whispers grow louder, their words finally clear. You are home. The engine roared to life, and the car began to move. I didn't touch the wheel. I didn't need to. The salt flats stretched endlessly ahead, and I knew we'd never leave. The Bonneville salt flats had claimed us, just as it had claimed so many before. We were part of it now, our stories buried beneath the endless white. And somewhere out there, another group would find our car, waiting for its next passengers. Story number 6. The Curse of Chugach. The Chugach National Forest is a place of extremes. Towering peaks, endless green, and a silence so profound it almost feels alive. It's beautiful, sure, but it's the kind of beauty that hides teeth. I'd heard stories about the forest my whole life, whispers of people who went in and never came out, of strange shapes moving through the trees, of voices that didn't belong. But none of that stopped us when we got the call. The search team consisted of me, my friend Mason, a seasoned hiker named Carla, and her brother Evan, who knew the area like the back of his hand. We were looking for Henry Chase, a local guide who'd vanished 3 weeks earlier. According to his family, he'd gone out on a solo trek and never came back. Normally, that would have been the end of it. People disappear in Alaska all the time, but then his wife received a voicemail. It was garbled, full of static, but Henry's voice was unmistakable. Stay away, he said. Don't come looking for me. The forest, the rest was lost in a burst of noise, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. Something was wrong. We started early, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves. Evan led the way, his machete slicing through the underbrush as we followed a faint trail Henry had likely used. It wasn't long before the mood shifted. The forest grew quieter, the air heavier. By noon, the birds were gone, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots on the damp earth. "This doesn't feel right," Carla said, her voice low. She'd stopped to examine a tree, its bark covered in deep, jagged scratches. "Bear?" "Maybe," Evan said, though he didn't sound convinced. He glanced around, his grip tightening on the machete. "Let's keep moving." The first sign of Henry came an hour later, a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch, dark with dried blood. It was enough to make my stomach turn, but Evan pressed on, his pace quickening. Then we found the cabin. It was small, barely more than a shack, its wooden walls warped with age and moss creeping over the roof. Smoke curled lazily from a metal chimney, the only sign of life for miles. Evan hesitated, his hand on the machete, before stepping forward. "Henry," he called, his voice echoing in the stillness. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. Or at least, I think it was a man. His clothes hung loose on his gaunt frame, his skin pale and stretched tight over sharp bones. His eyes were wild, darting between us like a cornered animal. But it was his voice that froze me in place, a low, rasping whisper that barely sounded human. "You shouldn't be here." "Henry," Carla said, stepping forward. "It's us. We're here to help." He shook his head violently, retreating into the doorway. "No help. Too late. The forest won't let you." "What are you talking about?" Mason asked. "What happened to you?" Henry's laugh was a dry, brittle sound, like leaves crushed underfoot. "It's not the forest," he said. "It's what lives in it." Before we could ask more, a sound rose from the trees. A low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Henry's face twisted in panic, and he slammed the door shut, the heavy thunk of a bolt sliding into place echoing in the silence. "Get inside," Evan said, his voice tight. "Now." We didn't argue. The cabin was dark and cramped, the air thick with the smell of decay. Henry sat in the corner, rocking back and forth, his eyes locked on the door. "It comes at night," he muttered. "It always comes at night." "What does?" Carla asked, kneeling beside him. "Henry, what are you talking about?" "The shadows," he whispered. "They move. They watch. And when they touch you," his voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. The sun was setting, the light filtering through the cracks in the walls casting long, flickering shadows. I felt it then, a presence just beyond the edge of sight, something watching, waiting. The growl came again, louder this time, and the shadows seemed to deepen, pooling in the corners like living things. "We need to leave," Mason said, his voice shaking. "Now." "We can't," Henry rasped. "Once you're in, you're in. The forest doesn't let go." The first attack came just after dark. It started with the scratching, long, slow drags of claws against the wood. Then the whispers began, faint and indistinct, a chorus of voices overlapping in a language I couldn't understand. The shadows moved, stretching and twisting, forming shapes that didn't belong. "Stay away from the windows," Evan hissed, his machete at the ready. The door buckled as something heavy slammed against it. The shadows coalesced, forming a figure that loomed over us, its eyes glowing with a dim, sickly light. Henry screamed, a raw, animal sound, and the figure surged forward, its limbs impossibly long, its hands ending in jagged claws. We fought. God, we fought. Evan swung his machete, Mason grabbed a piece of firewood, and I did the only thing I could think of. I threw a burning log from the fireplace at the thing. It recoiled, the flames licking at its form, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it split, the shadows multiplying, filling the cabin with writhing darkness. "Run!" Carla screamed, dragging Henry to his feet. We burst out of the cabin into the cold night, the shadows chasing us, their whispers rising to a deafening roar. The forest twisted around us, the trees closing in, their branches clawing at our clothes and skin. I don't know how long we ran, only that we didn't stop until the growls faded and the whispers were gone. When we finally collapsed, gasping for air, the cabin was nowhere in sight. Neither was Henry. It was just the four of us, huddled together in the endless dark. We made it out of the forest the next morning, though none of us could explain how. The trail seemed different, shorter, as if the forest itself had spat us out. We didn't speak of what we'd seen, not to each other, not to anyone. But I still hear the whispers at night, faint but insistent, calling me back. The Chugach isn't just a forest. It's alive, and it doesn't forget. If you ever find yourself standing at its edge, do yourself a favor, turn back. Some places aren't meant to be explored, and some people, like Henry, are meant to be left behind. Story number 7. Shadows in the Sand. The Mojave Desert is a place of extremes, heat that sears your skin, winds that strip the land bare, and silence so profound it can drive you mad. For most people, it's a landscape to avoid, a lifeless expanse of sand and stone. For me, it was an obsession. I'm Dr. Emma Reardon, a biologist with a fascination for the strange and the rare, and the Mojave had plenty of both. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found out there. I was chasing a legend, a plant called Artemisia infernum, rumored to bloom only once every decade under the right conditions. It was said to have properties that could revolutionize medicine, but finding it was like searching for a ghost. The locals told stories about its cursed nature, how it grew in places people weren't meant to go, but I dismissed it as superstition. I should have listened. The trip started well enough. I'd mapped my route carefully, packed enough supplies for a week, and hired a local guide named Miguel to help me navigate the desert's treacherous terrain. He was a quiet man, weathered by years of living on the edge of civilization, but he had a sharp eye and a way of moving through the desert that made him seem almost like a part of it. By the second day, we'd already covered more ground than I'd expected. The desert stretched endlessly around us, a barren sea of sand punctuated by jagged rocks and the occasional skeletal remains of long-dead trees. It was beautiful in a stark, desolate way, but it also felt wrong. The air was too still, the silence too heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. It was Miguel who first noticed the stones. We were climbing a dune when he stopped abruptly, his hand shooting up to signal silence. "Look," he said, pointing ahead. At the base of the dune was a cluster of stone pillars, each about 6 feet tall and perfectly smooth, as if sculpted by human hands. They were arranged in a circle, their surfaces etched with strange symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the sunlight. "What are they?" I asked, crouching to examine one. "Bad," Miguel said flatly. "We shouldn't be here." I brushed off his warning, more curious than afraid. The symbols were unlike anything I'd seen before, a mix of geometric shapes and organic patterns that seemed to pulse faintly under my touch. I felt a chill run through me, but I chalked it up to the wind. That night, the storm came. It started as a whisper, a faint rustling at the edge of hearing. By the time we noticed the sand swirling around us, it was too late to find proper shelter. We huddled behind a rock outcropping, our faces wrapped in scarves to keep out the stinging grit. The wind howled like a living thing, carrying with it a sound that wasn't quite natural, a low, mournful wail that seemed to echo from the stones. "Do you hear that?" I shouted over the wind. Miguel nodded, his face pale. "They're coming." "Who?" I asked, but he didn't answer. The first figure appeared just after midnight. It was barely more than a shadow, a humanoid shape that flickered in and out of existence like a mirage. At first, I thought it was a trick of the storm, but then there were more, dozens of them, circling us at the edge of the dunes. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. "We need to leave," Miguel said, his voice tight with fear. "Leave and go where?" I shot back. The storm was too strong, the landscape too disorienting. We were trapped. The shadows came closer. They didn't make a sound, but their presence was suffocating, a weight that pressed down on my chest and made it hard to breathe. As they moved, the sand around them seemed to ripple, as if they were part of the desert itself. Miguel grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. "Run," he shouted, dragging me toward the east, where the storm seemed less intense. We ran blindly, the sand biting at our skin, the shadows following close behind. I could feel their eyes, if they had eyes, boring into my back, their presence growing heavier with every step. I tripped once, my face plunging into the sand, and when I looked up, one of them was standing over me. Its form was indistinct, more suggestion than substance, but I could see the outline of its face, or lack thereof. It was smooth and featureless, a void that seemed to drink in the light around it. It reached for me with hands that dissolved into tendrils of shadow, and for a moment I thought I was going to die. Then Miguel was there, pulling me up and throwing something at the figure, a small pouch that exploded into a cloud of ash. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering violently before it disappeared. "What was that?" I gasped, my voice shaking. "Salt," he said. "Keep moving." We stumbled through the storm for what felt like hours, the shadows never far behind. They didn't move like living things, but they were relentless, closing in every time we slowed down. I don't know how we made it through the night, but when the storm finally broke, we found ourselves back at the stone circle. "They won't let us leave," Miguel said, his voice hollow. "Not until they're done with us." "What do they want?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Miguel didn't respond. He just stared at the stones, his eyes filled with a hopeless kind of understanding. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I remember the shadows growing closer, their forms more solid, more menacing. I remember the symbols on the stones glowing faintly, pulsing in time with the pounding of my heart. And I remember the sound, a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from the ground itself, vibrating through my bones. When I woke up, I was alone. The storm had passed, and the desert was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. The stones were gone, and so was Miguel. I stumbled back to civilization, my body bruised and my mind shattered. No one believed my story, of course. They said it was dehydration, heat stroke, a hallucination brought on by the harsh conditions. But I know the truth. The Mojave is alive, its sands hiding secrets that should never be uncovered. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I hear the hum again, faint and distant, calling me back to the shadows. Story number 8. The Crawling Stones. The racetrack playa in Death Valley is a place that defies explanation. A dry lake bed stretching out under a brutal sun, it's famous for its sailing stones, rocks that leave long trails in the cracked mud, as if they've moved on their own. Scientists have tried to explain it for years: wind, ice, water, anything to make it make sense. But none of their theories ever sat right with me. The truth was always more elusive, more sinister. I just didn't know how much until we went there. There were 4 of us: me, Dr. Hannah Moore, a meteorologist specializing in extreme environments, Alex, my assistant and a geology enthusiast, Beth, a data analyst with a knack for solving puzzles, and Connor, our logistics guy who'd been to more deserts than he cared to count. We were there to study the stones, to monitor their movements and, if we were lucky, capture the process on camera. It was supposed to be straightforward, science in action, nothing more. But the desert had other plans. We arrived in the late afternoon, the heat radiating off the cracked earth in shimmering waves. The playa was eerily beautiful, an endless expanse of parched mud bordered by rugged mountains. The stones were scattered across the surface, their trails stretching behind them like ghostly signatures. Some were small, barely the size of a fist. Others were massive, boulders that seemed impossible to move without machinery. Beth set up the cameras while Alex calibrated the sensors. Connor unpacked the supplies, muttering about the heat. I wandered among the stones, marveling at their strange paths. Some trails were straight, others curved or zigzagged as if the rocks had minds of their own. It was easy to see why people found them unsettling. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature plummeted. The desert silence grew heavier, the kind of quiet that feels alive. We gathered around the monitors, watching the live feed from the cameras. Hours passed with no movement, just the unchanging stillness of the playa. I was beginning to think we'd wasted a trip when Alex called out, "Dr. Moore, you need to see this." I hurried over, my breath catching when I saw the screen. One of the smaller stones had moved. Not far, just a few inches, but enough to leave a fresh trail in the mud. The time-lapse footage showed it jerking forward, as if pulled by some invisible force. "Wind?" Beth suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "There's no wind tonight," Alex said, pointing to the sensors. "And even if there were, it wouldn't explain the movement. The ground's bone dry." We decided to stay up, hoping for more activity. By midnight, the temperature had dropped to near freezing, and the stars blazed overhead in a sky so clear it felt like you could reach out and touch them. That's when we heard the sound. It was faint at first, a low scraping noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. We froze, listening. The sound grew louder, more distinct, the grating of stone against stone. I turned toward the playa, my flashlight sweeping over the surface, and felt my stomach drop. The stones were moving. Not just one or two. All of them. They slid across the mud in fits and starts, their trails crisscrossing like the tracks of some ancient, unseen creature. Some moved slowly, almost lazily, while others jerked forward with startling speed. It was mesmerizing, horrifying, and utterly impossible. "What the hell is going on?" Connor whispered, his face pale. Before I could answer, one of the stones stopped abruptly, its surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. A second later, it began to change. Its edges seemed to soften, its surface rippling as if it were alive. Then it quivered, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. The stone opened. A seam appeared down its middle, splitting it in two. Inside was a dark, pulsing mass that glistened like oil. Tendrils emerged, writhing and searching, and when they touched the ground, the mud hissed and bubbled as if burned. I stumbled back, my heart hammering. "It's not a rock," Beth said, her voice barely audible. "It's something else." More stones began to change, their surfaces cracking open to reveal the same nightmarish interior. The tendrils reached out, probing the ground, the air, each other. The scraping noise grew deafening, a chorus of movement and hunger. "We need to go," Connor said, his voice trembling. "Now." But as we turned to leave, the stones began to close in. Their movement was deliberate, coordinated, as if they were hurting us. The trails they left behind glowed faintly, a phosphorescent light that pulsed in time with the writhing masses inside them. We ran. The playa was a maze of shifting stone and glowing trails, the air thick with the sound of scraping and hissing. I tripped once, falling hard onto the cracked mud, and when I looked up, one of the stones was inches from my face. Its tendrils lashed out, brushing against my sleeve, and the fabric dissolved instantly. The acrid smell of burning filled my nose as I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging. We reached the edge of the playa, gasping for breath, but the stones didn't stop. They followed us onto the rocky terrain, their movements relentless. One of them caught Alex, wrapping its tendrils around his leg. He screamed, the sound cutting off abruptly as the stone enveloped him. When it rolled away, all that remained was a smear of ash and fabric. We made it back to the vehicle, Connor fumbling with the keys as Beth and I kept watch. The stones had stopped at the edge of the playa, their tendrils retreating, but their presence was palpable. I could feel them watching, waiting. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, the lights of civilization a balm against the terror we'd left behind. I filed my report, but no one believed me. The footage was corrupted, the data useless. Alex was listed as missing, his disappearance chalked up to an accident in the desert. But I know the truth. The racetrack playa isn't just a place where rocks move. It's alive, a predator hiding in plain sight, waiting for its next victim. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the scraping again, faint but unmistakable, as if the stones are calling me back. Story number 9. The Abyss Beneath Crater Lake. There's something about Crater Lake that feels ancient, eternal, as if the water itself remembers a time before people walked the earth. I went there searching for life, but what I found was something else entirely. Something I wish I could forget. I'm Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a marine biologist specializing in isolated ecosystems. Crater Lake had fascinated me for years, not just because of its striking beauty, but because of the stories. Locals spoke of strange ripples on the surface, shadows darting beneath the waves, and, most tantalizingly, a species of fish that didn't exist anywhere else. Most dismissed it as folklore, but I wanted to know the truth. I arrived in late September, when the tourists had thinned out and the lake was quiet. The air was crisp, the water impossibly blue, and the surrounding cliffs loomed like sentinels. I'd rented a cabin near the edge of the park and brought enough equipment to last 2 weeks: nets, cameras, sonar, and a small submersible drone. The first few days were uneventful. I took water samples, mapped the lakebed with sonar, and cataloged the local fish population. The ecosystem was pristine, untouched by human hands, but there was no sign of the mysterious species I was looking for. Then, on the fourth day, I found the crevice. It was barely visible on the sonar, a narrow fissure in the lakebed near Wizard Island. When I sent the drone down to investigate, the feed cut out after a few minutes, the screen flickering before going dark. Frustrated but intrigued, I marked the location and decided to dive it myself the next morning. The water was freezing, even in a wetsuit, and the weight of the equipment pressed heavily on my chest as I descended. Visibility was poor, the light fading rapidly as I sank deeper. I reached the crevice after 15 minutes, my flashlight cutting through the gloom to reveal jagged rocks and swirling silt. The opening was wider than it had appeared on the sonar, large enough for me to slip through. Against my better judgment, I did. The tunnel was long and winding, the walls rough and uneven. My breathing echoed loudly in my ears, a reminder of how alone I was. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a cavern. My flashlight illuminated the walls, and I froze. They were covered in drawings. At first glance, they seemed primitive, like cave art. But as I examined them closer, I realized they were anything but. The figures were intricate, detailed, and unnervingly lifelike. They depicted creatures I couldn't identify, elongated forms with multiple limbs, mouths filled with razor-sharp teeth, and eyes that seemed to follow me in the dim light. Some of the figures were human, or at least, they had been. Their faces were twisted in agony, their bodies entwined with the monstrous forms in a grotesque dance. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short gasps. I forced myself to focus, to take photos, to document what I was seeing. But as I moved further into the cavern, the air, or what passed for it, grew heavier. A low hum vibrated through the water, faint but insistent, like the sound of a distant engine. And then I saw the hatch. It was set into the floor of the cavern, a circular metal door with a rusted wheel in its center. The markings on it were similar to the drawings on the walls, etched deeply into the corroded surface. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn back and forget I'd ever seen it. But curiosity is a powerful thing. It overrides fear, common sense, even survival. I reached for the wheel. It took all my strength to turn it, the rusted metal groaning in protest. When the hatch finally opened, a cloud of silt billowed up, obscuring my vision. I waited for it to clear, my heart pounding, and peered inside. The passage below was lined with more drawings, but these were different. They moved. It wasn't possible, I knew that. But as I stared, the figures writhed and shifted, their forms twisting and contorting as if trying to break free of the walls. The hum grew louder, resonating through my body, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if it was coming from the passage or from inside my own skull. I should have left then. But I didn't. I descended. The corridor sloped downward, leading to a chamber that felt impossibly vast. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, but I could make out shapes, tanks, desks, equipment that looked decades old. A laboratory, I realized. Someone had been here before me. I moved closer to one of the tanks, its glass clouded with age. Wiping away the grime, I peered inside. Something floated in the murky liquid, its form indistinct. My hand trembled as I adjusted the flashlight, and then I saw it. It was one of the creatures from the drawings. Its body was long and sinuous, its limbs ending in webbed claws. Its eyes were open, black and empty, and its mouth was a grotesque maw filled with needle-like teeth. It wasn't moving, but it felt alive, as if it were watching me. A sudden noise behind me made me spin around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The corridor I'd come through was gone, replaced by solid rock. My breathing quickened as I scanned the room, the hum now a deafening roar. The figures in the drawings were moving again, faster now, their forms pressing against the walls as if trying to escape. My head throbbed, the pressure unbearable, and the room seemed to tilt and sway. I stumbled, my vision blurring, and when I looked up, the tanks were empty. The creatures were gone. The hum became a chorus of whispers, overlapping voices that seemed to speak directly into my mind. I couldn't understand the words, but the intent was clear: leave. I don't remember how I got out. One moment I was in the chamber, and the next I was lying on the shore of the lake, the morning sun burning my skin. My equipment was gone, my wetsuit torn, and the photos I'd taken were missing from my camera. No one believed me, of course. They said it was nitrogen narcosis, a hallucination brought on by stress and cold. But I know the truth. I can still hear the hum sometimes, faint and distant, calling me back to the abyss beneath Crater Lake. And when I close my eyes, I see the creatures, their empty eyes and twisting forms, waiting for the day I won't be able to resist.